Welcome to Talking Roadmaps, the channel where we talk about everything road mapping, from the good, the bad, and the ugly. Today I'm joined by John Cutler. I'm pretty sure most of you will have heard of him, but John, give us an introduction anyway.
Hello, everyone. My name is John. I have a background in product management and UX, and then before that, a life as a musician and startup founder, I guess. Early on, I made video games, which was kind of fun. I live in Santa Barbara with my partner and 5-year-old, and I love to write about product. I've been writing about product since maybe 2014 or 2015, probably written a post every couple days, every 4, 5, 6 days since then. I love exploring what I call the mess of products. I have a newsletter called The Beautiful Mess at the moment, and it's basically about how this is all a very messy, confusing space that we work in, and it pays for us to help to try to unravel that as we think about our work.
Absolutely. In fact, one of your tweets from, I think it was about 18 months ago, is one that I refer to on a regular basis.
If you're enjoying the channel, subscribe, hit the bell, and give us a like.
And it kind of goes to the first question I usually kick off with. I often ask, what's the purpose of a roadmap? But I remember your tweet was talking about, we ask the roadmap to do too many jobs. So maybe I'll rephrase it as, what's the job to be done of a roadmap?
Oh, geez. So you're asking me, and I'm going to list like 15 things. It really is contextual, and there are a number of jobs. So we could boil down some of the top ranking jobs. I do think that for some users within your company, I'll put it that way, the roadmap is a way to communicate our current thinking on priorities, on sequence, on focus areas. If you maybe do it in the right way on what we're more certain about and what we're less certain about. And for some of your quote unquote users internally, it's also communicating around when you think things might happen realistically. I don't think that's something people want to hear, but there is a job to be done there related to timing and sequencing that people care about. The reason why I mention the jobs like that is, how would you measure the efficacy of a roadmap? And is it doing that job? Is it catalyzing the right conversations? For example, if your roadmaps never are a catalyst for a discussion about priorities, and if you still just have a million priorities, they're not really doing their job very well, are they? So I tend to break it down that way. There's a whole long tail of jobs. I think I was working with a friend recently. We listed 15 other jobs, but those are some of the top categories that I can think of. A great example of variations in a job is, it's one thing to broadcast out something that you're generally sure people are bought into. It's another thing of when you're forming a roadmap, that early stage when there's going to be a lot of debate, there's going to be a lot of tension, and the conversations that you have are going to be shaping what you do. So just that difference, if you overlay across all those jobs, whether you're diverging or converging, already you've got 12, 15 jobs. So it's an artifact that serves many roles within a company.
Totally agree. And now you call them users. And in fact, the next question I usually ask is, who's the audience? So who are those users, and who have those different views or different jobs, should we say?
Oh, I mean, everyone, there's been people on your team. When you think about management, there's so many directions of management. There's management up and diagonal. There's manage to the side, where you're managing your peers. There's managing down diagonal. You're managing the people who work for your peers. You're managing the people who work for you. You're managing out to the customers in the world. You're managing out to the partners in the world. You're managing to the general company investors that you're doing. So there's a lot of who. I think you could draw some broad boundaries around, for example, the people who are involved in making the thing, designers, engineers, people who are involved in that, whatever you want to call it, the product org, or IT for some people, or R&D, or whatever you want to call it. That's sort of a boundary. And then as you get, you could say, once you get outside that, you have a myriad of roles: product marketing and folks in your other parts of your go-to-market organization, sales. I think that one of the big questions for companies is how much to actually engage with customers themselves. So once you get outside, how much is this meant for outside the building? What I've found, actually, which is funny, is, and I tell this to all the people who make the roadmap software whenever they reach out to me about, what's this mess all about, is I tell them that pretty much the PM's job is recontextualizing the same core bit of data in dozens of ways. So the idea that there's one roadmap, there's not one roadmap. There's sort of a core amount of information that gets recontextualized a dozen ways in your company. That's what makes picking tools for this kind of stuff very difficult, because it's very hard for a tool to handle that level of recontextualization. At that point, you might as well just write a document and put it in a slide. That's usually why people end up that way.
Yeah, interesting. So semantically, I think I phrase it slightly differently, but very much on the same page. I'll talk about it being one roadmap, but multiple views. So it's that same core single source of truth, but I'm communicating to a given audience, and each audience cares about different things, needs to be communicated to in a different way, and that's that recontextualization you talked about there. So I think very much on the same page, subtly different language, but meaning the same thing.
One thing that comes to mind when you say that is this idea that there's even a source of truth. I mean, yeah, there is, but the source of truth is very messy. The source of truth is the combined, assumptions and hypotheses and beliefs. And I think that people, they think there probably is some source of truth, but the truth is messy. So it's a source of messy truth is realistically what's happening.
Yeah. And in that truth, to me, is the assumptions, the hypotheses, everything is kind of there. It's a truth. You're making me think now. The truth is too strong a word, but there is one data set, I think, as you phrased it, that we're rendering in different ways to communicate. And that's kind of the current, I think someone else in a previous sort of episode called it consensual reality. This is what we're all saying is the reality. How close it is to reality is variable.
Yeah, maybe it's the source of truths. Truths, right? Like, yeah, that go on. I mean, a great example for that for people to dig into is, the current level of confidence with something. I mean, I'm coming to the belief that our goal should not be alignment in organizations. In fact, I think that alignment becomes a sort of toxic thing. I think that the idea you're going to align on a set of truths, but it's this idea of like how to get along with people you disagree with. And he has this basic section in it, which I really like, which is, simple collaboration requires alignment. Collaborating in any type of situation, which is more complex, requires coherence, essentially, where you can move forward while having very different beliefs on these things. So people who believe we have to agree on what the problem is and agree on the solution, he makes the argument, which is very persuasively, that in fact, we don't. We're not going to. And if you force that kind of agreement, it's going to be difficult. And he gives example after example of countries that have worked through their problems or people who've worked through their problems, where having very different beliefs are able to make progress and find things that meet their needs and things moving forward. And I think that that's something we don't talk enough about at work. We sort of have this veneer of alignment, assuming it exists, instead of being okay with that like source of truths. And I think that that's something that you have to constantly juggle when you're in this work environment. It was a compelling argument.
It sounds like alignment and agreement are being conflated a little bit there. Whereas I would separate them still a little bit. We can be aligned that this is where we're going, even if we don't all agree.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where, the words like congruence or coherence or, come. You could have somewhat congruent strategies or coherent strategies that don't necessarily mean, everyone agrees on every single item or that's what the company should do. A good example is there'll be some people in your company who want to realize short-term outcomes and benefits. And there'll other be people who are maybe tuned more into the long-term sustainability of the company. You're not going to, there's many reasons why everyone believes what they believe and do those things. And, the worst option would be to find the middling option, which tried to placate everyone. And the option of thinking about it more as a sort of polarity or like a liminal space between these groups where it's like, yeah, guess what? Some people want short-term outcomes. Some people want long-term outcomes. Let's not bang our heads against the wall trying to find the best trade-off between those things. Let's allow there to be that some level of dissonance as we're moving forward, and we'll learn our way forward. We'll get through. So it is an interesting thing too, bringing it back to roadmaps where it's okay to put big question marks on things. It's okay to embrace that there could be tension between groups about about certain elements of a roadmap. Maybe, of course, you need to create an environment where it's friendly to that type of tension, but it's something to consider.
Yeah, and I guess that comes back to the whole: do we have psychological safety? Do we have trust? Type thing in terms of creating high performing teams, which then allows for that disagreement without it getting personal. So if we put all these things together then, John, how do they how are they informed by vision, strategy, objectives? We're saying that maybe we can't have fully aligned organizations, but we've got to have a goal, a direction, and be executing towards that. How's that work in your mind?
Here's one thing I've realized about this is that people assume that a narrative exists in a company, and that's not exactly how it works. So for example, there are companies that pick these high-level pillars that everyone nods their head at. And realistically, they were never meant to really align the org. It's just much more for show. It's a sort of show of like, here's some broad categories where we're generally aligned. But what those companies are doing is they're pushing down the work of actually working out the details a couple layers down to different folks in their company, and they're working it out. And some companies do perfectly fine like that. In fact, the people in the company, if they say, we don't really look at those decks, like that's the ambiguous for show vision that we have. No one ever goes back and looks at the vision doc. No one ever goes back and looks at the mission document, but somehow it works itself out. And there are some orgs that do that. There's other organizations that insist on this very sort of strict cascade of things. We believe this, and then therefore we believe this, and this is why all our goals exist. And then there we're going to go and we're going to get aligned that way. The reason why I mention that is, anytime I go on LinkedIn and someone is like, okay, we have got to start with the why and the who or the thing. And anytime people put these little pyramids of we're going to start with the mission and vision, or anytime those layered thing, when you actually observe how companies work, they don't work like that. That's an abstraction. That's not even an abstraction. It's just a narrative sort of thing. It's much more that if you go on Wikipedia, there's this great article about something called the garbage can theory of organizations. And you should check it out, because what it says is that organizations are not this kind of logical entity. That there's many cases organizations are solutions looking for problems. That the people have solutions looking for problems, and we kind of work its way out. The reason why I mention this is that I think people over-index on vision. They imagine that the strategy will be this book strategy, like they read in Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, and they'll leave themselves disappointed because they're like, my company doesn't have anything. It's so unclear. I don't know. We don't have a strategy like I've read about in the books. And people will say, well, where's the pyramid? And then when you give them the pyramid, they'll say, well, this doesn't make any sense to me. It's just fluff. And then they get all frustrated about these things. And so I'm saying all this because to get an organization to move in a somewhat coherent direction, there's many ways to achieve that. And it's very cultural depending on how that's going to happen to do those things. And often you move in that direction in spite of what you try to do. You know that there's just the magnetic pull of a particular direction, and that's why you move in that direction. So that all sounds very philosophical and like abstract, but I think that from a very practical perspective, you need to feel out the real power of those things in your organization and spend time on them accordingly. If you work in an organization that has the sort of slide deck with the 3 pillars and the vision and the mission and the pyramid, and no one actually refers back to it ever again, don't waste your time trying to clarify that. The organization has told you that that's not how it operates. Spend time trying to figure out how decisions really get made in your organization and how the strategy really gets set, and focus your energy on that particular thing. And if it's the incentives, how budgets get put out, that's where you have to focus your energy to align. If it's the narrative with the board, that's where you need to focus your thing to align. Because companies will have those 4 pillars and no one tells you about the actual conversation in a back room that the board has with the founders of the company or something. So very practically, I believe in what you said, and I think that strategy, vision, mission stuff is important. However, I think that how that plays out in companies is very contextual. And as a product manager, you need to sort of don't waste your time on the places that don't mean anything. Just find out where those decisions are actually getting made. If it's the sales goal, in a lot of companies, it's literally the sales goal that gets communicated to investors or revenue goal. You know what? Not going to change that. So might as well hack that system and figure out how it can help support your roadmap.
I've spent quite a lot of time kind of around product people in that particular space. And I do feel that they feel the need more than any other function to have this clear vision and strategy. I think because, exactly as you said, they kind of feel like, oh, we don't really have one. And therefore, we're not doing it right. We're not doing it properly. And what I almost feel like you just did is give them permission to have that messy setup.
Well, it's also understand how decisions really get made in your company, and then think about what you need to do around that particular thing to get that level of alignment. And this is where I think that it's just very, very difficult. You also need to then, once you understand how things really happen, you can think about the adjacent possibilities. Like, oh, there is this meeting where this type of thing happens, and basically it's all sort of everyone just waits until the budget's approved, and then that ultimately informs the plan. That's a good opportunity to get the right insights into that particular meeting to see if you can do something better. The same thing is, I was chatting with someone who had worked at Google for however many years, 8 years. He's like, actually, we suck at OKRs to do those things. So the same thing, that if you're a PM and think, it's just about getting if we could just get our goals straight, we would be aligned. No, it doesn't. So you have to think about, like, what is there's the stated way of aligning, which might be the OKRs, but then there's the real way of aligning, which might be through influence. It might be based on customer persona or the sales quota or the whatever. And you should find that. And that's probably a good bit of advice for folks.
Totally love it. I remember I used to talk a lot about corporate theater because of having to play the games in the company to then create a more fruitful environment for my organization. It's like, okay, I'll do the annual budget cycles. I'll worry about playing the corporate theater. This is in a multi-billion euro kind of German organization. And then how we're going to actually take that budget and use it in the real world, quite different, because we're going to try to execute in a more progressive model. Let's see how it goes. And then there was me acting as a layer to kind of give that theater back to the organization, because it was otherwise stifling the things we were trying to do.
Well, a great example of this is, think how complicated we make it for ourselves. I mean, realistically, you should be able to go to each team and say, give me an honest 1-year roadmap, and just you can use whatever system you need to be able to keep it honest, and just keep updating it. Keep it relatively updated. In theory, that's completely possible. But do you notice what gets in the way of making that happen? There's a period in around August, September, when if you're on a yearly budgeting cycle, where people say, well, I don't feel comfortable I can't put stuff in the roadmap for January and February because of budgeting. They're worried. They don't want to make these. They don't know what the priorities are. If you've also noticed in big companies, in around March or April, you're only just getting going on the prior year's thing. So realistically, there's the magic months of the year are March, April, May, June, July, and August. You're only really working in a line for 6 months out of the year. The back end of the year is trying to finish stuff up and sort of anticipating a big change in priorities. The front part is just trying to figure out how you're going to work together to achieve those things. That's the reality. And so I think it's funny because conceptually, the idea of, like, each team will have a roadmap. They'll have a general sense of where they're going. People will look at it. They'll comment on it. You'll revise it. You'll keep it aligned with the company priorities. All that's like terribly quaint. It's too simple to be real. Like, imagine if life could work that easily. It can, by the way, but we make it so much more complicated for ourselves because of these other, the reality of how the flow of how it is for organizations. So I think that's you can either sort of fight that, or you can nudge against it, or you can go with the flow. And so that's sort of an option that people have to work with.
It's interesting. I was reading When by Dan Pink recently, and he actually makes this quite a strong case for those rhythms and those kind of patterns, that it's quite natural and human that we create those cycles. And Luke Herman, in his book, Software Profit Streams, talks very much about the rhythms and the events of your industry and your organization. Something I always used to do in my previous life was map the company calendar. Like, what happens? It's like every August, people seem to be surprised that we're going off into strategy season. Every October, people seem to be surprised that there's another budget cut. Yeah, it happens every single year.
There are efforts like this beyond budgeting thing, which is really interesting. And there are efforts to change that and to unpack these annual cycles into different things, which is very interesting. But that for many companies, that might be a step too far, at least in the short term, to do it. And so I think that when it comes back to something like road mapping or whatever, you just have to be aware of your company rhythms and where these things fit in. I just wish people could just maybe even lean into the theater. I mean, just have a big block on your roadmap that says, pending the strategy reset. Hey, we can't tell you what it is going to be beyond 6 months because we don't know. Like, how funny would that be?
I think I almost went the other direction of, I'm going to assume I'm getting the money, and therefore I'm going to plan ahead and keep going and almost make it reality, because if I'm talking to customers about that being the reality, the budget's going to follow.
That is it's amazing you said that, because I do believe that strategy for a lot of sort of senior PMs or frontline PMs, that's all you really can do. And I think I've been mentioning these question marks and mentioning this type of thing where, you walk into a meeting and saying, based on the assumptions that this is still important to the company, that we're still going to prioritize this persona, based on the assumption that, we're going to either, keep our team size stable or grow our team slowly to be able to do it. This is the general direction. Another great point about this, where people get into the road mapping thing, or it overlaps the road mapping discussion, is, I've seen people have these roadmaps, and then they'll do this kind of above the line, below the line kind of thing, where they say, well, if we get funding, we can go here, but if we don't, we can go here. The mistake, I think, of that is that if you have a healthy team that's working and getting stuff out there, yes, maybe adding a person might generally move it a little, you're moving it a little bit, you're continuing your mission, but you kind of maybe accelerate. And it's hard too. If you add someone to the team, honestly, sometimes it slows down, and you don't want to add someone to every team. So the amount of the road mapping stuff that overlaps, either delivery cadences or assumptions about velocity or assumptions about how fast the team is moving. The example that I give is, I met with a team and they showed me their 2024 roadmap, and it looks like they plan to finish 24 things. I just count, they happen to use a calendar roadmap, and I sort of following the end of every little row. And I said, that's 24 things. Well, how many things did you finish last year? 3. So how is it going to go from 3 to 24? Oh, everything for sure is going to finish right in the beginning of the year to do that. And the interesting part about this is that was used as some form of budgeting. And so you need to be very sure about the job that your roadmap is being used for by the people you show it to, because there's probably a better way to visualize that in a way that will communicate the current sustainable pace or lack thereof of the team. So you're not like entering into a kind of budgeting hell to do that. So that's a tip for people, is to know that your roadmap will also overlap the budgeting and finance discussions. So
absolutely. And yeah, funnily enough, you talk about different visualizations. My co-host and I, we've kind of identified 12 different visualization styles that we're writing a set of visual guides based on at the moment. I started talking about it literally last week in Cologne at an event, and it's like some of them break that left to right, for example, time horizon or time channel, which helps break some of the mental models that people have, but it's still showing direction of travel.
It's funny. I didn't get up to 15. We can share it in the show notes. I remember, this post I wrote, 11 ways different people visualize it. And so it is true. There's so many different visualizations that can inspire different conversations. And I think that's like, that's something that people don't realize, the psychology of that. In fact, I think for people who've done this a lot, this is very simple to them. But I met with a product leader recently who I just challenged them on this sort of swim lane calendar-based roadmap. And the funny thing is that they pinpointed one of the problems with it is that having blank space on that roadmap makes it look like the team's not busy. So it's just on the most basic level, you have a visualization out there and it's got blank spaces. So someone will say, well, can't I play more Tetris with that calendar to do these things? And then the other thing that's kind of funny is they're just very bad about communicating sequence and priorities. and the overlap between maybe estimates about time. So if you were to actually revisualize that in a now, next, later roadmap, you'd be forced to maybe force rank these things by their priority. Whereas if you look at a calendar roadmap, you're like, well, is that starting after that, before that, because it's a lower priority, or just because when we think we're going to finish that thing, and oh, I'm making the assumption that you must have 5 people on your team. It's like, no, the swim lanes are actually priorities. And so you can just see how these very minute differences in visualization can inspire vastly different conversations and or not trigger the conversations that are necessary for you to have. So you need to be hyper aware of that. And I think a lot of people know it intuitively because they find themselves a little bit nervous. You know, they'll say on LinkedIn, like, don't put dates on your work or whatever. And what I say to that is, hey, guess what? Generally wanting to know the sequence of when things might be done is a completely valid need in your company. However, you conflating that visualization is what's getting you into trouble. There's another way to visualize cones of uncertainty and when generally you might think things might land in a way that doesn't hurt you. And you just need to know about that. So I think it's just the visualization side is something I'm really fascinated about.
Likewise, it's one of the things I've come to realize is I did a lot of graphical visualization in my teens, and I'm suddenly realizing how important that set of principles and things that I learned there, as I'm starting to see the value of them now as I'm a lot older. I kind of liken it. I know I'm not likening myself to him, but how Steve Jobs did a class on typography at college, and then that informed his sort of desire to have great typography on the Macintosh.
That's awesome. You've taken your teenage obsessions onto your professional life. That's great.
So we've talked about we started to talk a little bit about the visualization. So if we're thinking about a roadmap, let's get concrete. What's on this thing? What's it made up of?
Depends. I mean, I've seen roadmaps at like 5 different levels. Some of the ways that I divide up a roadmap, I think that is probably similar to other people, is there is this sort of level of things. And so, an example is I'll say to a team, let's get up at the level of, I have this system of 1 to 3s, which has always worked well for me. So you can think about work just in terms of time. And it goes from 1 to 3 hours, 1 to 3 days, 1 to 3 weeks, 1 to 3 months, 1 to 3 quarters, 1 to 3 years, and 1 to 3 decades. So one simple way you could think of a roadmap is like, what level are we on? Are we in the like 1 to 3 quarter range here, where you'd only expect, you get a team, it's like there's 6 things on it. Like once you're at the 1 to 3 quarter range, max, you're going to have like 6 bets, whatever we want to call them, units of thinking, units of energy. You're going to be at one level to do that. I find that generally a roadmap that goes anywhere below the 1 to 3 month range is probably not going to do the team much good. It's already getting pretty too tactical on that sense to think about things. The 1 to 3 year level is really, really interesting because it kind of talks about the broad strokes and forces you to think on that particular level. So that's like one way I've thought about like the level and what goes on it. And I just call them bets, but I could just call them foos because I'm tired of believing they should be called just one thing. I think companies should name this stuff what they want. There's project, like for example, there is a difference between a project and just a general stream of initiatives that are going towards a goal. So what do we want to call one? An initiative? Want to call it a project? That, I like the word bets. I wish that everyone would just call everything on their roadmap a bet, but that's just me to do these things. And so I think you have to think about what the container is that you're talking about. And time is one way to do those particular things. I think realistically too that, I have this framework called mandate levels, which sort of talks about what level you're working on. Is it a do this type thing? Is it a do something that does this type thing? Is it a help this set of personas achieve some type of goal? Is it move a metric known to improve long-term business outcomes? Or is it all the way up to, own a financial outcome over multiple years? That's another way you could think about roadmaps. It's just sort of the sphere or the mandate of the work involved in that. One thing I've learned is everyone argues about, problems versus solutions or output or, outputs and outcomes and all that. It's all there no matter what you do. It's just the level that you show it. Someone's going to come to work wondering what the it is, and someone's going to come to work interested in what the outcome is. So I've kind of thrown up my hands and come to the conclusion that it's going to be a mess no matter what you do. And you just have to work across all these spectrums anytime anyway. So that gives, you can put anything on it as long as you're consistent and it helps the discussion and it's relatively consistent with what they're doing. One thing we learned a lot, I learned a lot from doing all these North Star workshops, is that one thing that's missing from a lot of roadmaps is a roadmap itself is, if you think about, I call them frames, but you could think about there's the work frame of the world, the value frame of the world, the budget frame of the world, the team view of the world, the goal view of the world, the sort of highly customer-centric view of the world in terms of their outcomes. There's many views. There's the architectural view of the world. There's many different frames we can think about the work that we do. I think most roadmaps give a little bit of lip service to maybe the stable value view of the world, but maybe don't as much as they could. And so what I mean by that is when we did the North Star workshops, you figure out this kind of North Star metric, which is a leading indicator of sustainable differentiated growth. You think about a series of inputs that guide into that are stable. At Amplitude, I remember our North Star and our inputs were stable for 4 years. They're not changing. They're the same. They're a mental model for value. And then you could link in roadmaps into those particular things. So that's what's missing, I think, for a lot of companies on what to put into it is they'll have roadmaps and they'll have goals. And then they might even have like delivery plans, or they might do that. But I'm not seeing the stable thing that you're hanging all that stuff on, the stable model that you're hanging that stuff on for in the span of years to do those things. So it becomes this very reactive, cascadey kind of thing, where, if you can't figure out a model that remains, or set of models, and it can be a customer journey map, it could be a North Star framework, it could be a funnel, it could be some customer health model that you have, it could be a list of capabilities that are going to last for a long time. If you can't come up with that model that stays foundational and stable, it undermines the efficacy of all these things. And then it causes teams to overburden their roadmap or overburden the goals because there's this missing, so one practical way to think about this is teams often have, swim lanes in their roadmap that are centered around some kind of goal, but you don't really know how that goal fits into the broader scheme of the company. It's a little bit disconnected. So I don't know if that helps also people think about it, is that, don't overburden your roadmaps necessarily to try to fit all of those frames. It pays to be specific and to flesh out the rest of it so that you can make sense of what you're doing.
I guess those frames may relatively well overlap with the different views that some of those different audiences or users care about from earlier.
I love that. But one of the things that you hinted at there, which is incredible, is that when you're small and you're a startup, these frames overlap to the point where you don't think they're different. So here's an example, like the architectural view of what you're doing and the team view of what you're doing and the work view of what you're doing, the goals view. When you've got this just one team, you just look at the team, and that's called the app growth team. I don't need to see their roadmap. They're called the app growth team. Just tell me what your goal is, explain what the model is, explain what growth is, and tell me how you're going to move those particular metrics, and then give me a reasonable plan, just heads up about what's coming down the pike to the rest of the company. And all those frames are together, right? That's why you budget that team to do app growth. That's their goals must be around growth. Oh, their architecture must be the stuff related to how we're going to get growth. As companies grow, though, real world is that these frames sometimes drift apart. And this sounds very abstract, but it's very practical for people, which is when you're in a company that feels like there might be debt or there's disconnectedness between the org chart and the work, or when you feel that tension, like there's this incoherence problem, it's because these frames have been drifting apart and have tension. And that's really kind of the job of these. It's never perfect. You're never going to have a perfect thing. You're always going to have these projects that overlap all the teams in your company. And so when you think about your road mapping and stuff, just realize that when things are growing fast and there's a lot of things, you need to accommodate the fact that these views aren't always one and the same of what you're doing. Because when you're small, you can just have one view and everything's okay and it's good.
Yeah, and interestingly, It brings me back to one of your earlier points where you talked about how when the roadmap can look too empty and people feel like people aren't doing anything, sometimes taking things from one of those other frames, one of those other views is what happens to stuff it in to make it look full. We're doing this re-architecting work, so we'll put that on there because now they know what we're doing and we don't look like we're not doing anything.
Oh, and well, one of my pet peeves is not having just one roadmap for the engineering. And like when people say, well, we've got our customer facing roadmap and then we've got our tech roadmap. This is a great analysis of this is a great test case for what we're talking about. They've separated the roadmap for a reason. Now, when I've talked to people who are in that situation, one thing that the technology side of the house will say is they'll say, you know what, we don't want this to be micromanaged the same way that PMs are micromanaging their customer-facing roadmap. So, the PM's going to show the rest of the company, here's the roadmap. Now, if you included the technology items on that roadmap, what question does that trigger? Some executive is going to look at it and say, but why are you doing all this other stuff? And so I had a CTO one time tell me, it was super funny. They're like, oh, I don't want to put my work up on that. Because if I do, it's going to be micromanaged away. I think it's necessary. I think it's important. Product, you take 50% of the capacity, you do whatever you want to do with it. I will manage the other 50%. And no, I don't want it visualized by the rest of the company. So this is a good example of where, in theory, back to keeping it simple and how this world could be completely uncomplicated if we could all be exactly the same and think exactly the same. You'd be like, well, why just put it all on the roadmap? I mean, how can you know where your chips are being played if you don't have it on one roadmap? In the real world, it's like, no, I don't want to put it on that roadmap because I don't want to be micromanaged to do those things. Back to that point, though, I do believe bringing those views together, if you can, is smart. If you can create an environment with that type of safety, because the downsides, I think, outweigh the upsides. I think ultimately not, and then of course, the internal product managers come back a year later and say, no one respects our work. And it's because your bosses decided that they didn't want it on the same roadmap. So there's always, it's never a free lunch for this kind of stuff, but it is a good example of how these frames and stuff can make life easier and complicated at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's where it comes to my different views. Like some audiences, I would show the technical side, but maybe not with the customer. Again, it's like, because they really don't care.
Yeah, that's a perfect, and another thing too is how much detail do you want in there? If the technology org is generally making it easier to deploy and put stuff and the product to be more stable, and you might want to put a performance thing on that roadmap that you shared to customers because it's going to mean something. And you know what? You might just want to have one lane, which is basically like keeping our team shipping quickly, shipping fast for your benefit. You don't need to break down all the nitty gritty of those internal things, but you could hint at it to have a good discussion with your customers about, hey, we might not be shipping as quickly as you think we should be shipping. However, that's because we're allocating some percentage of our time to making sure that we can keep shipping this way from now until eternity, right, to do this. So I think that you can make strategic decisions about what you display depending on the audience. That's a good maybe takeaway.
So let's go a little bit philosophical. We've already gone there a little bit already, John. What do you consider best practice when it comes to road mapping?
To me, best practice is basically building the house and then layering the roadmap on top of that. And so what I mean by that is like building the foundation is maybe a better way to put it. We talked before about strategy and mission and things like that, but I do think that I tend to think about this as kind of a loop, this data-informed product loop, which is something I thought a lot about while I was at Amplitude. And first, you need some kind of strategy, some kind of opinionated belief on how you're going to win, or like whichever philosophy you buy into, you need some kind of strategy of it. Then I think you need to translate that into one or more accessible models in your company. And like I said, that could be a range of like a driver tree or customer journey or customer health, like something that then you can talk about, because strategy can be pretty vague. And then if you translate a strategy immediately into projects or actions, that's sort of skipping over a loop, so that's kind of making the big jump already to what you want to build or what you want to do. So I think that the intermediary step is translating that strategy to one or more accessible models the team can think about. Then you need to add some level of measurement to that for those models. So very practically, you start with a strategy. You say, you know what, we're going to use a customer journey mental model of how things are. We're going to use a customer maturity model of how things are. We want to nudge our customers up their levels of maturity in their use of our product. And we're going to use a general sort of growth-oriented driver tree. So those might be the 3 models that you pick. So the next step is just make sure you can reasonably measure that stuff, either qualitatively or quantitatively. Like, do we know what the parts of the model are? And then this is where the roadmap comes in. It's a little bit, at that point, you have to identify your leverage points. Like, where are you going to be able to have the most impact given the models you have and the strategy you have to be able to nudge the organization forward? And the reason why I mentioned those 3 things before is I think without those 3 things, your roadmaps are going to be doing too much work. You're going to be overburdening them with both the model. You're going to be trying to inject some strategy into them, and it's going to be difficult. If you do that legwork before, then you get to a fairly straightforward, like, what are our opportunities and leverage points across different time horizons, like 1 to 3 years or 1 to 3, whatever. And then what are we going to try? What bets are we going to run? What experiments are we going to do? What are we going to build to move that? And then you have to kind of measure the impact of that and go back. When I say best practice, though, I think it's very important to know you can achieve those primitives in many different ways. So the words that I'm using, like bet or leverage point or whatever, might seem arcane to you, and that's completely fine. But I think that the general idea is, like, we need to have a general sense of strategy. We need to get it out of our head into some set of models. We need to then think about what our opportunities are, set goals around those opportunities, where are the leverage points. Then we need to go and think about where we're going to get to. So I think how this translates into a roadmap is, generally your roadmap should have, or when I've seen best practice is, at least, is that the team is pretty adept at going from both the leverage point view of the world, what are the opportunities, down to what they're going to try, the more work-like stuff. And then I think when it comes to communicating to the rest of the org about timing and sequencing, I think generally the best practice is doing that without screwing yourself up. Like, how do you give an honest appraisal about where things are and what's flowing through the system so that other people in your company can plan for it, without glossing the stuff over and making it feel like it's realer than it is, or, you just got to communicate responsibly and reasonably to the particular company. And then I think finally is just getting the right types of feedback across all those things I just discussed to make sure that the team, you're not surprising the team, or you're aligning people in the right way. So I don't know, I just described it like a sort of process, but that's how I generally build the house for teams. Build the foundations to get teams to the right spot.
I know process is an evil word to many people, but actually it's a super important part. I think I quote an old boss of saying, good process shouldn't get in the way of good work or good business, but it is there to enable and empower us.
Well, the other thing, I think, yes, process gets maligned. I think that, yes, because sometimes people don't agree that you can achieve these things in different ways, right? They're very prescriptive about how you would go about doing it. I also think that if we just change the word process and we said, like, somewhat of a common vocabulary, if you don't forget about process for a second, can you have the discussions that you need to have? And are you reducing the cognitive load of team members? And are you giving them an interface to interact with the rest of the company and the rest of the environment? I think that people assume that process means centralization and standardization in ways that are going to reduce the productivity of teams or reduce the creativity of teams or do that. But try driving down a road without road signs. Imagine you go to the supermarket and there's no way to check out, really. You just have to find someone and tell them that you want to buy it. And then they sort of try to think about, it wouldn't, you have to find those things. Another example of that is, imagine you're in a company and I say bets and the other person says initiatives, things. Now, the danger, of course, are in some companies, they say, well, we're going to call everything a project, or we're going to force everything into this scheme. And then if it doesn't reflect, the thing I've learned in the last couple of years is if it doesn't reflect reality, people will either phone it in and pretend they'll just do whatever they want to do and just check the box on whatever sort of standard language you have, or you'll take the creativity out of the room. You'll force people into a different reality. And so generally with the stuff like process, and a great example is people will say, okay, every team needs a strategy and every team needs a vision. Now, if you're looking at the strategy and vision and there's something missing for what you need, like maybe it doesn't reflect reality, you'll either just zone out from the company and be like, oh God, I've seen that deck again for the millionth times. I'm just going to do whatever I want to do. Or you'll just conform to it in just checkbox kind of way to do it. So I definitely am a process believer, but I think that if you think of it as common language, if you think about it as the lightest amount of central language or centralization you need to do that, if you think about it reducing cognitive load for people instead of increasing it, then it's like an internal product. Forget the word process. Like it's just how we work can be a decent way. And I think actually it's pretty uncertain times these days with how companies are and the funding and whatever for the company. Is the last thing people on your team want to be doing is knowing how to plug into whatever you're doing and participate. And so that's a quick win to just make it accessible and not have people scrambling in certain ways. That's my take, at least.
If you had to distill your philosophy on road mapping down to 1 or 2 sentences, what would it be?
Think of them as products.
And is there anything I should have asked you about road mapping that I haven't?
I think there's probably a good question around seniority in a company and what's reasonable to expect from a frontline product manager for their space. So I think that one thing that's come up a lot is that this information is all very available to people, and you have folks who are, PM working with their team in a much larger company. And I think they're aware of some of the practices, and they're aware of maybe how one could be more outcome focused or things. And maybe their company is not bought into those ways of working, but I think there's probably a good question around, okay, you get this all and you've internalized it and you're there on your team, but that's just not how you work. You're on the hook to give this, annual roadmap. All the frames are collapsed into each other and no one even acknowledges that, what to do. I think that the answer for those folks is a little bit what you were getting at, which is maybe hack the system a bit. Maybe your company requires things, like list all the projects you want or something. The advice that I tend to give there is no one's going to fire you if you do an extra layer of work. So you could always go in there and say like, okay, I did this thing, you want the projects, but I've augmented the roadmap view you want with the 3 customer problems that I told you about. Or adding a little assumption line at the top, like this assumes this and this. Or when you might be asked for this prescriptive thing, but you fold those under the key levers that you exist. So that's a very practical example. It's like, well, we need this very prescriptive project-based roadmap for the year. Please give it to us in a calendar format about when you think things will be done, and that you can just nudge the system a little bit. For example, you could add confidence intervals at the ends of the row, at the ends of your work items. So you're like, well, it could range this way. You could do a scenario plan and you could say, oh, we ran a Monte Carlo experiment. And this is the distribution of times that these things could take, assuming that we're asked to do this. You could add like row labels to this, or like tags on top of them that this hits these strategy points. So just hack the system, throw in an extra slide that said, if we view this as a map or graph of some kind, here's where all the items would fit. That's an example of one that I've seen in person that just worked great, where people, they show the calendar roadmap and they say, if we were to view this in this other way, latched on to something like a driver tree or some other things. And then basically all the work are these little solutions, in the opportunity solution tree thing, it would be these little solutions or the leaves. And it kind of blows people's minds. They're like, oh, I love this calendar-based roadmap. And the next thing you show, it's like, this is how it all lines up. Sometimes people who do that in that meeting, the people say, I like that view. And sometimes it's even an executive, because the executive isn't mired down in this whole world of like, why does the engineering team require these estimates? And why do they think they need to put it in Jira in a certain way and all this? And they see that value-based view and they say, I want that for my next presentation. Can you give me that? So just think about how to hack the system is sort of how I generally think about it.
We often even suggest you might think about a roadmap for your road mapping, where you are now to where you want to get to, and think about those stages between there.
One other tip there is, there's a book by someone named Julie Dirksen, and she's written 2 books, Designing for How People Learn, I think is the first one. And then the next one is called Talk to the Elephant. It's a kind of behavior design book. And if you want to think who's influencing me about road mapping at the moment and thinking about it, it's actually books in behavior design and other things, because I tend to think of them as a product, and what behaviors would we observe if this is working? So that's a very good question for your team. Like, what behaviors would we observe on our team if whatever these things we call roadmaps or whatever working in the way we wanted them to work? And you might say, well, we'd be having more discussions about customer value. We would be having more clear understandings of our priorities. But even that's not a behavior. What does that mean? We'd have more clear understanding what the priorities are. Try to get even more specific to the behavior. We would be in a position where we said no more often, but we would point to the artifact that we have. And generally the person that we said no to would understand why and how that fits. So I love the book because he talks about specific behaviors. And that's a hard question, because you notice even when I was just telling you that, the first thing I said was not a behavior. Like, we would prioritize stuff that means X. I guess that's a behavior, but you're not telling me what we would see and observe. The reason why I mention that is, if you're thinking about a roadmap for your road mapping, a good way to think of it is, how often are we experiencing either the behaviors that are working for us or not working for us? A great example here is the kind of thrash that happens on a quarterly basis, where people, they don't, you've done all this work to create all this roadmap, and yet right before the end of the quarter, none of them are like up to date enough to understand the state of the world. And then it causes this big disruptive quarterly hit to what people are doing. That's a great example of like, what behaviors would we observe if it was working better? And it would be like, well, you know what, this is an example where teams who have this dialed in, the end of their quarters are non-events. Things have changed a little bit. The roadmaps were still there, just like they were before. They've hit some goals, but they're setting goals on the next things. The difference between a company that has this dialed in and hits the end of the quarter and a company that's struggling is massive. Like, the difference between, say they have 1,000 people, the difference between spending maybe 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 hours across 1,000 people at the end of the quarter, which is very, very expensive, or having to spend 20, 30, 40,000 hours at the end of the thing. So when people think about, oh, this stuff doesn't mean much difference, think about how many employees you have and how much thrash that they have, and then multiply that by what you could be spending your time on. And then you start to get to some of the behaviors you might observe if your roadmap was working.
So, John, I think we'll wind it up there. Always at the end of the session, love to give people a chance to pitch themselves, how people can get hold of you, how you can help. Fire away.
Well, I think pitching for me is, I just love chatting with people. I think LinkedIn is the best we got at the moment. So if you want to reach out and connect on LinkedIn, mention the show, and we could have a conversation or chat or get on the phone. I think that, that's the degree that's going to give me the most joy at the moment, is just chatting with people who have diverse perspectives on this stuff. And so, get in touch.
Been a pleasure. Thanks very much.
Yep, you too. Bye.